everyone, and welcome back. Today we're talking about My Brilliant Friend, Season 3, Episode 2, Fever. We find out what's been going on with Lila, and Lila has not been doing very well. She has totally isolated herself from friends and family in hopes of starting over and living her life on her own terms. However, in order to move forward, you must have the courage to look back, and in her case, this means calling Elena. And never have their differences been more clear than in this second episode. And while Lila is on the verge of death, Elena is moving on up. At face value, she is thriving. She is getting married to a man that seems very well-rounded, comes from a good family, treats her very well, her family approves of, and yet internally she is suffocating. And I appreciated how the director is showing us Elena's sort of internal struggle. Like, there's a scene where her ring is about to be put on her, and I appreciate the visual in terms of showing us and not telling us, because this show has a lot of narration, and it is one of those shows where you could easily over narrate. So it seems, again, like visually this director is doing a good job so far. I also like the tension between the sort of bourgeoisie and the working class, you know, and their bosses, and how they're kind of playing out these very complicated dynamics through Lila's character. We'll begin with Elena and the proposal. And so in the last episode, Elena was terrified. She told her fiance, "My family is not for you, and you are not for them." And right off the bat, it seemed like they were one big happy family. He fit right in, and everything seems to be going very well. It's time to meet the parents and her family. You know, they're in their Sunday best. And again, like, there's a light atmosphere. So although he is from a higher class, his aura, the way he presents himself, it was quite calming. And her father agrees to allow his daughter to marry him because he comes from a good family. He has money, he's well educated, and more importantly, he says it's because he makes Elena happy. And a lot of this criteria is normal even to this day. And the reason for that is because when getting married is one of the few ways in which you could actually move up in class. It's the easiest way. And not only will you move up, but your family moves up as well, right? The family reputation as a whole is affected by this. Despite this sort of wonderful dinner, there's still this issue of like the church. And so Elena's fiance, he is a communist. He doesn't believe in church weddings. And her family is saying, like, listen, it's just a formality. So what's the big deal? You know, just go on with the show. And that's exactly his problem, right? It's like, it's a show. There's nothing substantive about it, which is why I don't want to do it. And he's a very smart man. Like, the way he framed it, to be honest, like, I fell in love with this man. You know, he's like, listen, I would love to go along with this, but if I did, I would be a liar. Because up until this point, he's told Elena, like, these are his principles, and this is how he wants to live. So she's gonna either have to accept him or walk away. And his reason for not giving her the church wedding is because if he agrees, although superficial, he's saying, well, your daughter would never forgive me. Being the intelligent woman that she is, how can you trust a liar? You know, how can you trust someone that's so untrustworthy? And I think he would make a great politician, because the way he framed it, like, they couldn't really say anything, especially Elena's mother, right? And she always has something to say. And so they were just speechless, right? And it is disappointing for her family, but this is sort of like the price they have to pay. But Elena's mom does not lose the opportunity to have the final word. She tells him straight up, like, if you hurt my daughter, I'm gonna kill you. You know, this is the pride of our family. And again, this is true, right? In a lot of cultures, the woman is like how you judge a society or how you judge a family, right? Like, how you raise your women is very important in terms of how people see you as a whole. You know, that's why a lot of families and a lot of cultures are very protective over the girl, because the reputation of the female is, it can greatly damage, you know, a family's reputation. And so he agrees. He's like, don't worry, I'm not going to hurt her. Everything will be okay. And, you know, I think some part of Elena wanted her parents to say no. You know, that's the feeling that I got. Because, you know, at one point her mother makes a comment, you know, saying he's not that great. And again, this is before his speech about the church. And Elena says, well, he's no better than dad. And I think with her fiance, like, he offers a very stable life, like her father, right? Like, if you have a good father and you come from a two-parent household, you want to marry someone like your dad, right? Someone who makes you feel secure and safe. And, you know, unfortunately, you know, all Elena is seeing at the moment is she's just going to end up like her mother, just in a nicer house, right? So that scene where the ring is being forced on her, but it took me a while to realize that actually wasn't happening. But that was a very, very clever direction, you know, again, like showing us her internal state and not like narrating it to us. So again, I think she feels like no matter how hard she worked, like, you're still a woman in society, right? Now it's official. She's getting married, and I find it interesting, like, all the things that Elena is doing on the side, because it doesn't seem like she's putting all her eggs in his basket. So before she meets Lila, we find out that she's learning how to drive, and that she's been kind of saving money, right? Her mother kind of scolds her and says, like, how much have you stashed away? And Elena's like, that's none of your business. So I get the sense with Elena, like, she doesn't want to fully depend on this man for everything. Like, there's still that 1 foot out the door feeling that I get. And just on a side note, I appreciate how they show this connection between Elena moving up and her family moving up, because through the apartment, right? So now they have a TV. And so although they live in the same place, their living conditions is increasing, you know, and the reputation, despite her book, I mean, this marriage pretty much makes up for all of it. And so again, like, it's important to know, like, family reputation is massive when it comes to deciding who you're going to marry and who you're not going to marry. And so she's kind of going about her day when she gets some surprise visitors from the past. And so she notices a knock on her window, and who's there? Enzo and Pasquele. And they basically inform her, like, listen, Lila is sick, and we think that if she talks to you, she'll feel better. And Elena was like, Lila? Like, what happened with Lila? And right off the bat, like, Pasquele was just giving vibes. Like, he was just like, we know you're an important person, but if you could spare a minute or two, like, his whole energy, I just wanted to slap him on the screen. I'm like, settle down. And again, the perception of Elena has changed, but she doesn't see herself any different. You know, she's a bit offended because she's like, listen, I'm still from the same neighborhood as you. You need to settle down and not use that against me. She gets to Lila, and Lila is doing horribly. You know, she looks like she's on her deathbed. Like, she's about to recount her final days. Her appearance has totally changed, right? Like, in the last 2 seasons, she's been living this posh life. But now you can see the effects, right? Like, her face, her hands, like, throughout this episode, you can see her deterioration. And not only that, she hasn't kept in touch with her family. So it seems like her mother has locked herself away. Her brother is broke. Like, we find out in this episode that he's pretty much begging for money because, you know, there's really nowhere else for him to turn. Her father is working, and the neighborhood has a very sort of bad idea of her. And so family reputation there is not good. As soon as Elena walks in, she's like, give me a kiss. You know, she starts bossing her around again. And then she just piles her with, like, the congratulations, right? Congratulations, I heard you're marrying above your class. Congratulations. So Lila has been following Elena's career. And I think she's, even just seeing Elena, like, she's happy that she's able to not just move up, but move up legitimately, right? Like, actually break through into this other class of people that, you know, they never dreamed accessible before. And so in this conversation, before she can tell her story, she forces Elena to promise her that she will take her child in case something happens to her. And so this is a series about Elena trying to figure out what happened to her friend. And so the fact that Lila forced Elena to promise to take her child suggests, first, Lila has always sort of planned on disappearing, right? Like she wants away from everyone. And not only that, she says, if you need help raising him, ask Nino for money. Which again, it's like, why is Nino involved unless he's possibly the father of the child? But Elena is hesitant, and she's hesitant for a lot of reasons, because although she would be happy to take it on, you know, maybe not happy, but willing, trying to raise a whole child while she herself is trying to fit into this upper class, you know, especially with someone like Lila's reputation. The child still has a father. So Elena's like, you want me to do what? And in the end, she agreed, but I think she was hesitant because she knew that this was a promise that she quite possibly would have to fulfill. And so with that, Lila proceeds to tell Elena everything. So the last time we saw Lila, she was working at a meat factory. And the conditions of this meat factory are exactly as horrific as we would imagine them to be. It's dirty, people are harassed, it's cold. You know, it's pretty much exactly what you would think. And the first thing she discusses is like the humiliation of working, you know. And during this time, unions were not really well established, and workers' rights, like, what a concept. That's not really something that, you know, would really take anyone would take seriously, especially in the case of like labor workers. So if you were working with your hands and doing this type of work, you're from the lower class, right? And not only that, but you're basically akin to an animal. And that's what Lila proceeds to describe, right? Like, she was basically treated like an animal. And so there's a scene where we kind of see right away, like, this is not a place you want to be, where one of her coworkers, he kind of makes a dirty joke. And she tries to tell Bruno, her boss, but he's like, listen, the agony of this place, like, what do you want me to do? You know, it's kind of like, you know, survive as long as you can, but there's really nothing anyone can do to help you. And so I think the first thing I noticed in this factory scene is that there's really nothing standing between Lila and anyone, right? Like, anything can happen to her in this place. Like, although she may be able to fight, the question is for how long? And so she's going about her day when, according to her narration, she gets a blast from the past and a surprise visitor changes everything, and the surprise visitor is Pasquele. So Lila at this time is living with Enzo, and they seem to have like a cordial relationship. I didn't really sense anything sexual in their relationship at first. You know, they're just kind of cohabiting together, and it seems like she's entirely dependent on Enzo for shelter. And so Pasquele comes around, and immediately you could tell he still has feelings for her. You know, he's looking her up and down. He's complimenting her on her strength. And he's able to kind of break down her walls, because eventually she relents and says, okay, if you want to come here, you can come here anytime. You know, you don't have to ask. And he's like, grazie, like, thank you so much. And I caught a vibe from Enzo right away. Like, you could tell he was a little jealous, even though he's not the jealous type. And again, their relationship is platonic, right? Like, she needs a man's protection, especially during this time. And so, you know, the platonic nature of their friendship, it was clear when at one point he was studying and she offered to help him study. And she kind of teased him, right? Like, she's kind of touching him, and he's just like, oh my God. And again, she's entirely dependent on this man for shelter. And while she's helping him study, you know, the issue of the factory comes up. And Lila at this point is deprived of all intellectual stimulation, right? She doesn't have Elena to kind of feed off of. Like, besides Enzo, there's really nothing else. And then you work in these factories. And Enzo, you know, he kind of had a feeling that there was something wrong. And not only that, it seems like Enzo's working conditions are quite different from Lila's. You know, because he kind of asks her, is everything okay? And she gets triggered and she leaves. And I think watching Lila in this factory, again, there's nothing standing between her and anyone else, right? You're just vulnerable. You're in a vulnerable position to be preyed on. And the scene that exemplified that was the scene with Bruno. So Bruno is her boss, and you know, this scene in the meat storage area took me by surprise. And there's a lot of things you can kind of make of it. So she's at work, and then her boss comes in, and he starts kind of talking about the past. You know, he's like, remember this, remember that. And Lila's sort of impression of him, like she didn't feel like she was in danger. She didn't really feel like this is someone that she would potentially have to protect herself against. You know, she was listening to him, and she's like, yeah, you're right. And then he starts to like sexualize the meat. You know, he's like, you know, I hate this factory, but something about this meat hanging on this wall reminds me. Like, he was just talking shit. Like I don't see how any of this could remind you of anything. But what I got out of it is he sees her as like a piece of meat, essentially, and he just attacks her. And the whole scene when he's attacking her, I really thought he was gonna go all the way. You know, it took me by surprise. And he kept talking about gratitude. Again, like, it's not about, you know, is he attracted to her or not attracted to her. Like, in his mind, she works for him. And so it's kind of like, I'm gonna do it because I can get away with it. Like, that's how that attack felt. Like, he did it because he knew he could do it. And God knows how many people he's done that to. And she's just like, well, you're gonna fire me if I don't go through with this. Like, what, you know, and by chance, you know, like she faints. And thankfully Bruno stopped his attack, but her fainting is the first sign that her health is severely deteriorating. And, you know, she passes out, and he's like, is everything okay? Which I thought was rich. I'm like, is this irony? And she leaves, and she's like, you're gonna regret the day you ever touched me. And of course, these are empty threats, right? Like, you can talk a big game, but at the end of the day, you know, it's your word against his. Okay, so watching her at this meat factory, you realize, like, she's really in a, like, she's living day to day, right? Although she's able to fend him off today, she might not be able to do so tomorrow. And so she agrees to go to this communist meeting held by Pasquele, and they're talking about workers' rights, right? And the people in the audience are people like Nino's ex-girlfriend, who comes from a well-to-do family. And again, this is a theoretical exercise for them. Like, there's a difference between, you know, talking about the working class and being a part of the working class. Like, saying we need to fight back and do all this stuff is great, but at the end of the day, like, people need to put food on the table. People need to support their families. Like, you can't just abstain, right? Like, there are ramifications. And the people who suffer are the working class, ironically, like the people that you're trying to help. And so during this time, they say, okay, Lila, like, she gives a speech. Her speech was fantastic. You know, she basically says, what is there to learn about the working class besides misery? You know, from morning to night, it's misery. And she talks about her physical appearance, right? Like her hands, and like, just look at what I go through. And the thing about the hands is true, like, especially when it comes to like labor intensive jobs, like, it would be clear that Lila was in the working class. You know, like, she is not, you know, she's like, you would see it in her hands, you would see it in her face, you'd probably smell it on her body, you know, like, where this person is coming from. And so when she's showing her hands, what she's saying essentially is that, you know, like, who's gonna give me a chance looking like this? And she talks about the female experience. And the way she talked about the female experience, she talked about it like it didn't happen to her. Like, she was talking about it like, you know, the women, they get harassed like daily. She talked about the system that's set up to catch thieves. But really, you know, it's a way for people to abuse their power, especially if they want someone. And the whole time she's talking, Enzo is looking at her like, is this your factory? Are these your conditions? Because, girl, these are not my conditions. Like, he's just looking at her shook. You know, he's shook, and the people like sitting are taking down her every word. You know, like, they struck gold. You know, they're thinking like, finally, you know, we have something to run. And so she finishes her speech and they kind of praise her. They're like, you should come back. And she's like, listen, the only thing people like me want to do at the end of the day is sleep. You know, I don't got time to, I don't got time for your tears. These people, they didn't have a care in the world. And they printed her words, it seems like, on this flyer. And the way in which they printed her words, like, there is no doubt that it was Lila who said these things. Again, like, it wasn't anonymous. There was no care into thinking how it would affect her. So they printed her words and, she's under siege, right? And there's a scene where they're giving her the flyer and she doesn't recognize the guy from the meeting, but he recognizes her, right? And again, that tells you like the different places that they're in. She takes the flyer and then someone pulls her aside from the meat factory and said, did you say all these things? We're not harassers, we're not. She's like, I have no idea what you're talking about. The way in which they printed her words, it wasn't hard to narrow down who would have the guts to say it. And so she goes back to work and she gets hell, right? Like Bruno starts going in on her. She's like, you're a troublemaker. Tell me the truth. I know it was you. And she has no choice but to lie, right? She's in a dangerous situation because if she admits to it, she's fired. And not only that, like, her reason was valid. She said, you know what, I have a child. Why would I risk my job? And she didn't risk her job, right? She didn't know that they were going to print these things. Had she known, she would never have gone there, right? So she's just as surprised as everyone else. And there's this like really nice scene where, there's a Christmas tree in the factory and he's like, get rid of this Christmas tree, and it's such a fake gesture, right? To kind of bring humanity to this really dingy factory. And after that, he's like, okay, I'm done pretending. Remove the tree. You guys are all going to go back to being treated like animals. So again, it's the little things. Lila, at this point, she's in survival mode, right? So she needs to go and find out why on earth they would print these things. And at the same time, I think she's falling in love with Pasquele, right? It seems like she's very infatuated by him. And I think she likes the idea of him. And so she goes over to Nadia's home. Again, she wants to confront this girl and say, why did you do this? And the whole time she's in Nadia's home, she's noticing all the nice things she has. And she makes a comment about her own son. Like, as much as she can educate him, like, he'll never move up in class. This kind of false correlation between education and class. Like, just because you're well educated doesn't mean you'll move up in class, right? Like, the two are not necessarily true. And so, her, just the way she's thinking about it, like, for someone like her son, someone will always be superior. And again, that's probably why she wants Elena to take him in case something happens to her. And just before she talks to Nadia, she discusses like the idea of risk. This idea where like Nadia and people like Nadia, although they want to help the working class, they're not risking anything, right? It's like you're perfectly comfortable risking people like Lila and their jobs in order to make a point, without again thinking about the ramifications, right? Like, people need jobs, people need like it's one thing to talk about it, it's another thing to, as Lila experienced, to be harassed, to be yelled at. Like, this is not a fun experience. Nadia comes home and right away, like, Lila is disgusted because she sees Pasquele with them. And I'm not gonna lie, seeing Pasquele with Nadia's group, like, he was so out of place. Like, there was something treacherous about it. You're like, hey, whose side are you on? And so she looked pissed off. She starts screaming at them, right? They go to the room and she starts yelling at them. She's like, what have you done? Do you have any idea? Like, I might lose my job. Like, she's really going in on them. And I thought this was the best scene in the episode because they're trying to be like she kind of says, okay, what happens if I lose everything? What if I'm homeless? Can I stay here? And they're like, see, yes, that's exactly what, they're like, girl, we're trying to help you out. And I love that. I don't know why, like, I would have passed out too, like, so I guess at least they were willing to take the consequences. But I really enjoyed that, like, unison of like, see, yes, quit your job. Like, they're all basically saying, why are you working there? Like, work with us. And again, if you're in Lila's position, it's really not something you can do. And so she passes out. She totally passes out. First, I think from stress and also from working in that factory. And we find out a lot about Lila's health. So she passes out and they pretty much start asking her a bunch of questions. The first being, have you had your period? And she hasn't had her period in months. And they ask her about the pill. And of course, she's never heard of the pill. And the idea that you can take a pill and you won't have children is like insane, right? And Lila's reaction says a lot about her, right? She was just like, why are we talking about these things? So again, like, you don't talk about your period. You don't talk about women parts or issues during this time. But what the doctor essentially says to her is that you are sick, you're malnourished, you have a heart problem, you need to take it easy. And Lila kind of says, you know what, I don't have time for this. She waves them away and she leaves. You know, she thanks them and she leaves. And when she's being driven home by Pasquele, she kind of downplays her sickness. And her reason is that, like, she's in survival mode. And Pasquele, he's kind of giving her empty promises, right? He's talking about political opportunities. But there's political opportunities and, like, work reality, right? Like, right now, the only sure thing in Lila's life is this job and Enzo, right? Shelter. And she's not really willing to risk that for, you know, for someone's kind of like what we could do. And so unfortunately for Lila, she gets home and Enzo sees the two of them and he goes off, right? He's like, why is it that I'm the only one who never knows anything? Why is it, you know, and Lila's a bit scared because she's on the verge of losing her job and quite possibly, you know, the place that she lives in. This whole scene where Lila offers herself to Enzo, it really threw me off. And it really threw Enzo off, right? His reaction is like, really? You want to spend time with me? Like, since when? And again, I never got the sense that he, you know, like, there was no, like, he likes her, but there wasn't any of this sort of territorial stuff until Pasquele came in. So I think with Enzo, it's his male ego, right? He doesn't want to feel like he's being used or he's being, you know, made fun of behind his back. Like, I think that's how he took her sort of closeness with Pasquele. And, you know, she really kind of, you know, she offered, but at the same time, I think she was hoping that he would back off. Because at one point she says, okay, together or in our own rooms? And he's like, no, in the same bed. And the whole time she's lying next to him, she's freezing, she's sweating, she looks sick, she looks pale. You know, she does not look healthy. And again, when you look at Enzo, he seems fine. So wherever he's working, like, they're not undergoing the same thing. As this fever is getting worse, like, her situation is also getting worse, right? It's getting to a boiling point where it's like all the effort that she had done to kind of maintain some independence is about to, like, she has to start over at the end of this episode, right? Like, she has to go back to zero. And I think the thought of that is also adding to this, like, stress. And so I really like how this episode, like, trickles in a bunch of, like, people from the past, because at one point she's walking home from work and we bump into Gino, and Gino is another trash dummy, you know, like, he's the same person that was, you know, telling Elena, like, remember that time where you showed me your boobs? Like, he's a fascist, he's a proud fascist, you know. He's just, you know, at one point he gets really angry with Lila and he says, you know, I have permission from your husband to smash your face in. Essentially telling her, like, you're not a woman to be respected. You know, like, you've been disregarded by your family. Like, you're not a person anymore. And him being who he is, you know, he pushes her to the ground. Like, he starts fighting her. And I like the scene between the fascists and, like, the communists when they start trying to beat each other up with, like, a baseball bat. Like, I thought that was very well orchestrated. You know, like, it was just a very aesthetically pleasing scene. And again, like, the way this whole episode is shot is fantastic. And I also like the title, right? Like, fever, right? Like, it seems like everybody's getting crazy, right? Like, this was a small fight, but it's gonna escalate into a bigger and bigger situation. And so I think incident after incident, like, it's getting harder and harder for Lila to maintain any type of normalcy. And so she just kind of breaks, right? She's at work and she's kind of telling everyone, like, listen, all our problems are connected, right? My sickness, this place, like, we don't have time to wait for a union. We need to improve the conditions of this place right now. And again, Lila's talking from a practical perspective, like this whole thing about protests and all this stuff, like this will take time. But for right now, like people are dying, she's dying, like they need solutions. And so she goes and she tries to talk to Bruno, and who's waiting for her? Michael. And Michael is like the boiling point of this fever, right? He's the person that just like destroys the thermometer. And Michael's another dummy who thinks he's way smarter than he is. He's like a little boy dressed up as a man, right? Like everything about him is like, I wouldn't go anywhere near this man. And as soon as she walks in there, Bruno looks scared of him also for some reason. And right off the bat, you can tell that Michael is obsessed. And he's always been obsessed with Lila, right? He's like, remember the company we started together? I could have made you a queen. And he's obsessed. He has a very inflated sense of self. And I think he really resents the fact that Lila just doesn't respect him, right? With someone like Michael, he really needs external validation. And the idea that a woman like can judge him the way Lila does is disgusting to him. Like there is something about Michael where he wants to win. And then he goes off about a few things. First, he tries to make her feel guilty for the conditions of her family. Basically saying, listen, you leaving destroyed your family. I hope you're proud of yourself. And then he goes off about what it means to be a man. He's like, well, a real man knows how to control a woman. You know, like a real man would never like, you know, take this. And you know he's a real man because he calls Lila crazy. Like anybody who calls a woman crazy is to be avoided, right? He goes off about how crazy she is. She's intelligent, but she's crazy. And the reason that she's been able to kind of go off like this is because she hasn't been disciplined properly, right? If you can't channel that energy, then you're not a man, right? Otherwise, these women, they hurt you. And the whole time he was talking, you know, it was just, I mean, he's proof that like, although he has some money, in terms of class, like he's not much better than Lila, right? And he's trying to wield some type of power over her. And then he starts talking about like her body and, you know, how like starts making fun of her body and like all these things. But again, it's just to show like how his obsession, like he literally can't stop thinking about her. And so Lila is disgusted and she quits, right? She opens her jacket, she's wearing red, and she walks off. And I think this whole sequence of her leading up to the beach, it just kind of shows like rock bottom, right? This is her worst nightmares have come to life, and now she has to start back at nothing. And so the fever is getting worse, so her body's deteriorating, but also her life is deteriorating as well, right? As hard as she tried to like salvage it, it's becoming more than she can handle. And so I really appreciated the direction because the whole time she's on the beach, she's getting like, she's screaming, right? She's like, don't touch me, don't hurt me, don't, like she's really like you can feel her anguish. And again, I appreciate the showing us and not telling us. And so she ends up at this beach and, you know, she's reached the end of the line, right? There's nowhere else to go from here. And eventually she passes out from just exhaustion. And again, it's that realization, like, things can only get, you know, they'll get worse before they get better. And so that takes us to the present day times. And the whole time Elena is watching her, she feels guilty, right? She's like, this could have easily been my life. This could have easily been me. And Elena, you know, she watches over her as she sleeps. So Lila's last request is, okay, just stay here until I fall asleep. And whether or not she wakes up is really the question. So overall, I thought that was a great episode. You know, there's so many parts that you could unpack. But watching Lila deteriorate is interesting because she's basically like a phoenix rising from the ashes at this point, because it can't get worse, right? Her worst nightmares have already come to life. So either she moves up, you know, she rises, or she dies. But overall, those were my thoughts. Let me know what you think, and until next time.